Sometimes writers just get exhausted and they thought, they had this wonderful idea. And if they get stuck somewhere, they kind of feel like, oh, well, maybe this wasn't such a great idea and maybe I should just stop. And my job in that respect is to sort of help them get past that. And it can be anything from a kick in the pants to a cheerleader type attitude to really delving deep and saying, okay, what is it that you don't like?
You're just listening to Sue Toth, a book editor and coach. I'm Lee Schneider, and this is The Future Lab. The Future Lab tells the stories that shape the future. It's where thriller, science fiction, climate fiction, and fantasy authors discuss how we shape the future with the stories we tell today. Sue is a book editor and coach who specializes in romance, mystery, and thrillers. She keeps writers inspired, helps them work the writer's block, and helps their books be born into the world. I want to ask Sue about the special challenges of writing climate fiction, and she offered to have a conversation on the show about how her developmental editing work with thrillers could also apply to climate fiction. She answered my questions about her process with writers, what must-haves in a thriller might also apply to climate fiction, and what special something you need to find in yourself to keep on writing your book and get it out into the world. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Sue Toth. All right, Sue, welcome to the podcast. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, let's get right into it. I want to know first, what does a book coach actually do? And what's the difference between book coaches and editors?
Okay, well, I'm going to start with the second question because it's a pretty easy distinction. An editor works with a book that's already been completed. And, we can get into all the different kinds of editing and all that stuff later. But the biggest difference between an editor and a book coach is that the editor works with the book once it's finished. As a book coach, I work with my clients throughout the process. And that involves an awful lot of things. It can involve motivational talk, like if an author is getting, tired or losing their motivation or doesn't like the book anymore. We brainstorm through different issues with the book. If they're having a problem with the character and they don't know where the character should go, or if there's a plot point that they're just not sure which way to take something. And again, I do it throughout the process. It usually means weekly or every other weekly meetings and just sort of a work in progress.
I'm interested in one thing you said. I'm interested in all of it, but I'm interested in one thing in particular. If the writer isn't interested in the book anymore, that sounds fairly serious and also fairly common, I would guess. So what's the approach there?
Yes to both. Sometimes writers just get exhausted and they thought, they had this wonderful idea. And if they get stuck somewhere, they kind of feel like, oh, well, maybe this wasn't such a great idea and maybe I should just stop. And my job in that respect is to sort of help them get past that. And it can be anything from a kick in the pants to a cheerleader type attitude to really delving deep and saying, okay, what is it that you don't like? Dig deep and figure out where you're stuck. And once you can do that, then together we can get through it. And I'll help you figure out ways. And that can just be, it's mostly brainstorming. We'll sit and have a conversation and they'll say something and I'll say, well, did you ever think about maybe taking it in this direction? And most of the time that gets, it's like an aha moment, like the old light bulb over the head moment that they need.
Wow. I mean, that's a great thing to be able to offer somebody because, to state the obvious, we writers are so often in our heads And
Hmm.
it is easy to hit the wall. I don't use
Yeah.
the term writer's block because I quote an old joke. Have you ever heard of plumber's block, where the plumber comes and tries to fix the bathroom and says, I just can't do it. I can't fix the sink. I'm very sorry. You know, there's always a way out or around or through, but I can readily see where it takes another person, just another mind, to help you get there, to see that.
Yeah. And that's what I love to be able to provide is, the outside person who's, not your spouse or your best friend or your sibling or something like that, who's going to really see it and really tell it like it is. They're not going
Yeah.
to say, oh, it's all so wonderful. But on the other hand, I don't like to be a dream crusher either. And I will help my authors find a way to get, as you just said, around or over or through whatever it is they're dealing with.
Before I finish reading most books, I skip to the end to the acknowledgments, and I
Okay.
see who's there, and then you learn a lot really about how
Right.
that book actually got written.
Okay. I thought you were going to say you skipped to the last page to find out what
No,
happens.
I used to do that. That was
Yeah.
my MO as a kid. I would read the first word or the first couple words and the last couple words, and if it made sense, then I decided it would be a good book. But
Or the
I don't
books that
use
you were
that.
assigned in high school, right?
Yes,
The ones that you never wanted to read.
right. I no, I don't use that method any longer.
Okay.
So let's talk about thrillers for a minute. We'll transition over to climate fiction in a moment, but
Okay.
you have helped a lot of thrillers come into the world, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on what are some of the non-negotiables for a storyline for a thriller, or what does a thriller absolutely need to have in it that the author has to include for it to work for the thriller audience?
Well, at the risk of sounding obvious, it has to be thrilling. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but I am going to go into a little bit more detail about what I mean about that. It needs to have a real hook, something that readers aren't expecting, or that they thought they were expecting one way and it goes the completely opposite way. That's the thing it needs to have. And another thing that I think is really important that I'm going to illustrate actually with an example of someone I worked with is that the action needs to start fast and keep going. I worked with an author once who was a retired airline pilot, and he was writing a book about the hijacking of a jet. And to make a long story short, in the first draft of the book, the jet didn't even take off until chapter 11. And I explained to him that no one's going to wait around for this to happen for this long. And the problem was that as a retired airline pilot, he felt that he wanted to put all his knowledge of what a plane goes through before it takes off into the book. Like, this machine has to be at this many PSIs and it needs to have this much gas. And I said, I get that you're very knowledgeable and I really respect your knowledge. Like, I'd rather have you flying my plane than some bozo who doesn't know what he's doing. But you've got to get the action up more toward the front or your readers are going to go away. They're not going to last 11 chapters. So I think it has to come quick. It has to leave the reader breathless almost. And it has to be really thrilling.
Now, one of the most powerful tools at a novelist's disposal is time. You can manipulate time.
Yes.
Does it ever work to cheat and, in the sense, take the teaser, take the most exciting part of the book, take chapter 11 and just put it as chapter 1?
It can. It can. I've seen that work where you start with the ending almost, and then you go backwards and you put the twists in there. Am I allowed to mention a book by name?
Of course, sure.
That I didn't edit.
Yeah, why not?
There's a book that I read recently called The Plot. And it was a book about a down on his luck writing teacher who basically stole the manuscript of a student he had that passed away. And So, okay, you think, and that comes out in the first couple of chapters. So you think, all right, well, what, like, we already know the ending. What could possibly be thrilling about this? Well, I'm just going to let you read it because the twist just kept coming and coming and coming. So that's where one example of where it really worked. So yes, that is possible.
It's possible, but I'm guessing here, but I think it might break an important rule for most thrillers, which is most thrillers that work for me have this exquisite attention to time and place.
Yes.
It's what we used to call a TikTok before there was TikTok.
Before, yeah.
So people will be confused if I use that term, but basically every second of the clock is accounted for, and you know where you are in space and time
Right.
at all times, because that's what makes it a thriller. Am I right about that?
You are right about that. And yeah, I mean, there's so much of it, so much of the thrill depends on time. And, there's only a certain amount of time left before something horrible is going to happen, or space where, they're about to walk off of a cliff or something along those lines. So yeah, you need to have a very firm grasp on time and space to make a thriller a good one.
Do you recommend that your writers, how do they keep track? What do they do? Graphs, Excel spreadsheets?
They do some of that. To be quite honest with you, I think that's where an editor comes in. Because really so many people get lost in telling the story. And then all of a sudden, something doesn't make sense. Like the time is off or the space is off or something just goes wrong. And that's when you need that person who's a fresh set of objective eyes. Because oftentimes I found that it's a fairly easy fix. It's not like they have to rewrite the whole book. It's just if you make this little change and that little change, it will work. But if you don't, then it doesn't work, and your readers are going to catch you on it.
Yeah, speaking of readers, early beta readers or alpha readers become super important in this.
They do.
And
absolutely.
Oftentimes you'll get notes back, at least I do, that say,
yes.
I just stopped reading, or something went wrong there and I didn't pick the book up for 2 weeks. Suddenly you realize, as something failed on the writing side, it's like when you're writing plays or movies, writing dialogue for people, and the actor just can't get the line out of their mouth. They just can't say it. And you realize it's not the actor's problem. It's the writer's problem because you missed something.
And the thing with thrillers is you want your readers not to put them down. Those are the kind of books that you're supposed to stay up until 4 o'clock in the morning reading, even when the alarm is going off at 6. And if they can put it down for 2 weeks, then they're not that thrilled. And yeah, there's something wrong on the writing end that you have to grab them in and keep them there.
Now, if we were to talk a moment about climate fiction, which is kind of an emerging genre, there's a few practitioners out there like Kim Stanley Robinson and Paolo Bacigalupi and a few others. But if we were to think about climate fiction, can the thriller idea, I don't want to say formula, but can the thriller idea be mapped on to a climate fiction plot, or are there changes needed?
I think it can. I think to some degree you might have to suspend disbelief a little bit. If you think about what's really going on in the world right now and what's really happening with our climate, you could speed that up and make a great thriller out of it. It would have to be vastly sped up, but just the things that are truly happening in the world can make for a scary enough, thrilling enough situation. So I do think that belief needs to be suspended somewhat, but I think it's definitely doable, especially with extreme hot or extreme cold. I think those are two great things to use.
Mm-hmm. And authors have used those before, drought in climate thrillers, if there is that genre yet. I wanted to think about some of the objections that readers or maybe writers might have to writing a climate thriller. And one of them is it's too depressing. It's too depressing to talk about this. But my, if you will, my objection to that is, well, spy thrillers are pretty depressing. I mean, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold is a brilliant but kind of depressing book at the end of the day. A lot of the Ludlum books, a lot of books that I would call thrillers are sad in a way. So is that a reasonable objection to not trying to tackle a climate thriller plot?
My first thought on that, as you were discussing this and asking the question, is authors should write what they most want to write and what they feel best about writing and what they feel really good and that, you know, can really keep them going. And if a climate thriller is not that, then it's probably a thing you should stay away from. But yet there are people who are, you know, brilliantly into science and meteorology and know a lot about the climate, just, you know, as it really exists. They could be the perfect people for that. And they could write a thriller that would truly be thrilling and really keep readers on the edge of their seats. So I think if you want to do it, you're going to do it great. And if you don't want to, this is probably a specialty that you shouldn't pick then. But I also will say, I agree with you that other thrillers can be very depressing. I mean, thrillers where people are, you know, maimed and harmed repeatedly, those are pretty depressing. You know, so I don't know if that's a really good excuse.
There's this funny thing that happens in some thrillers I've read where the author will introduce a character with loving detail who we don't know, a brand new character, and I realize they're going to kill this person in a particularly grisly and maybe even, dare I say, entertaining way in about 10 pages. It's kind of like a palate cleanser. There's something weird that goes on even in Agatha Christie novels where you just get into the darkness as something weirdly entertaining. I don't know quite how that works, but it seems to work pretty well in the books it's applied to.
For those who can do it, again, I mean, for those who can do it well, yeah. Are we all looking into a dark side of our personality that maybe we would prefer not to realize exists? Well, that may be, but it's entertaining for whatever reason. I mean, I love a good thriller, and some of the thrillers that I've read, people are, as you said, gruesomely killed, and like some people say, how could you like that? But I just enjoy it. So you will find an audience. If you have the mind for it and it's what you really want to write, you will find your audience for sure.
I think what trips people up sometimes in writing climate fiction or wanting to write it is the sense of mission. Like, this is good for you. This is organic. You need to know this. And some authors do that really well, like Bill McKibben or Kim Stanley Robinson. You know, there's lots of them who they basically, it's called, the term is hard science fiction, and they have real science in them. Not McKibben is not a fiction writer, but Robinson is. And they have a sense of mission. You know, they want to bring you these ideas. But thrillers are, let's call them fun, even dark fun. I mean, you read them and write them because it's fun to do it, or you're entertained, or you're driven. It's not like this is good for you, this is organic, these are your vitamins, take your vitamins. So, so how would you coach someone who's saying, well, I have this weighty vision of the climate, but it's too hard to write that way. I'm getting tripped up in my own kind of ponderous mission. What would you say to someone?
I think I would start with using the good old analogy to the elephant. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. I would take it slow. I would want them to look into and really dive deep and figure out where they're having a problem. What is it that they can't seem to get? And then again, so, and I know this sounds kind of like I'm saying the same thing over and over, but it really takes brainstorming. That is so much of what an author needs. There's not any one particular, like, if you need to learn math, you start with addition and you go to subtraction. It's not like that. It's brainstorming and getting people to think and just kicking around ideas until the right thing hits them. And that's how I would that's how I would handle a situation like this too. There's no real science to it. It's got to come to you.
Well, it's also dialogue. It's about not dialogue in the book, but dialogue between two people or more. Even if when I'm not working with a coach or an editor, which has been rare these days, but if I'm not, I will use an audio recorder and I'll literally brainstorm with myself. Yes. I'll go for a walk and I'll literally talk out the story or talk out the problems and then listen to that back and sometimes transcribe it. And the answer can come in the dialogue because you need that kind of back and forth, hopefully with another person, but sometimes with yourself to see your way into the next step for sure.
And that's why writers groups, I'm sure it's probably a little bit difficult to find climate change thriller writer groups, but if you search long and hard enough, you'll find your people, and you will be able to find somebody to talk this out with. It just amazes me how, and sometimes I'll be talking to an author about something completely not related to the problem at hand, and all of a sudden it just comes to them. So I think the act of speaking and writing, as you mentioned a minute ago, really, really help.
And let's talk about the audience, because I bookmarked that in my mind. Now I want to come back to it. How does any author, find their audience? Well, some of it comes from writing what you really want to write, but there's kind of two parts to this story, right? It's first connecting deeply with what you really want to write, and then it's finding the people who want to hear that. So what's been your experience with, how does all that work?
Well, while I will tell you that I don't do as much marketing, I work with the books before they come out. The things that I do know are internet research is just amazing. Like you'll literally find groups for pretty much anything. And then you have to market to those groups. You have to go to those groups. You have to participate in them. Not just say, hey, I wrote a new book and I'm trying to sell you my book, but participate, answer questions, ask questions, get to know the people. The authors in any genre, the authors that I find that do the best are the ones who get to know their readers, who will do a Facebook group or a Discord group or, and maybe have a live session at some point where their readers can come and ask them questions. How did you research this particular piece of this book? And, that's how I find the audience comes. And when you have a real specialty genre and, climate change thrillers would be included in that, people are going to talk to one another like, hey, I read this really great book by so-and-so. You got to pick it up. If you're interested in this, you've got to get it. And I think that's how audience grows.
To what extent do you recommend people really dial in the subgenre of thriller? Because we're talking about thrillers like it's, there's only one type of thriller, but
right.
There are many different types of thrillers and subgenres. So do you encourage specialization, as it were?
I don't encourage specialization in the writing process. What I will encourage, though, is after it's written, let's look at what subgenres it fits best. My fear, if I tell a writer to do that while they're writing, is that they're going to get tunnel vision and they're going to lock themselves into one way of thinking, like I can only write this kind of thriller. It can't be anything else. I would rather them write from the heart and from their head and, what comes out. And then let's figure out where it belongs. And if we had to make minor changes to it after the fact, then that's not so bad. But I don't like to see a writer pigeonhole themselves in the beginning of the process like that.
If we had to dial this in and go wide angle for a moment and just think about, are there 3 keys to writing a thriller? Are there 3 or 4, you pick the number, best practices for doing this that you really have to check those boxes?
As far as the completed book or while you're writing?
Let's say developmentally, like I have an idea for a thriller, and maybe in my case it'll be a climate thriller, but what do I have to think about when I'm in that early developmental stage, when I look at my messy notes, all my scribbles, and say, all right, let's go back and figure out what are the keepers here?
Okay. Well, I would say the first thing you want to do is be sure that are people really going to be thrilled or shocked by this? I would think you'd want to do a little research to make sure that there's not a book out there with very similar or the same idea. Now, that's not possible to find any and every book that might, have the same idea. But I would take at least somewhat of a look and make sure that nobody has done the exact same story. And then what I think you have to do is really sit down and make sure, okay, do I have enough twists? Do I have enough crazy stuff? Do I have enough stuff that people aren't going to expect? And if I don't, where can I add some in? Can it be the characters? Can it be the setting? Do I need to add another story arc? Do I maybe have too much and I need to take something out? Those are the things that I think that you need to be careful of. And does my action happen quickly, and does it move along? Pacing is so important in a thriller. Pacing is important in any genre, but in a thriller, I think it's even more so, because if people get bored, they're going to put the book down for 2 weeks and say, oh, well, I didn't get a chance to pick this back up. Well, it's the last thing you want.
Definitely. It's interesting when you're talking about complexity. I was really interested in hearing that it's not just plot. The first impulse, certainly mine, is to put a lot of stuff in the story, make the story more complicated. But you mentioned characters can deepen and get more complicated.
Oh, yes.
And settings. There are lots of other things that can help the story get richer, deeper, and yes, more complicated.
Right. Yeah, characters can really do that job for you. And in fact, I think they're a very important part of that job, because if a character is boring in a thriller, it's not going to be as thrilling. I think the setting, the weather and the climate change, or, the house or the lighting situation, or there's just hundreds of different things that can make something more exciting.
So if you were to give a couple of pieces of advice to any writer, not just a thriller writer, what would that advice be?
I guess the one thing I would say, and this isn't just for thriller writers, it's for any writers, don't give up. There are a lot of places out there where your book can be seen. There's, independent publishing. There's, of course, traditional publishing. There's hybrid publishing. There's, magazines where you can do like a series, of and finish your book in various chapters and stuff. There's so many ways to get your work seen. So I would just say, don't give up. If you feel strongly about this book, then don't give up on it. And I guess the other thing I would say, particularly for climate change thrillers, is do your research. There's so much real science out there. And I think while we might be suspending disbelief in a thriller, I do think we have to make it based on some sort of real science. or else it's just going to seem silly at some point.
So if listeners want to know more about you and what you do, where can they find you online?
I have a website. It's www.suetoth.com. It's pretty easy to find, and it's SUETOTH. And it talks all about me and what I do and how I do it and all that stuff. So I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn as Sue Toth Editing.
Well, thanks so much for joining me on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was fantastic. I've loved chatting with you.
Thanks for listening to the Future Lab today. Please consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps the podcast. If you have some comments for me, go to memo.fm/thefuturelab and record them. I may play them on a future episode. That's memo.fm/thefuturelab. See you next time. I'm Lee Schneider, Artistic Director at FutureX.